It's a strange thing, but when the doctors then testified before the Warren Commission, they changed their opinions. They said it wasn't a wound of entrance, but a wound of exit. Now, what would have caused professional men to change their minds? There's several things that came to play. First, public opinion came to be, where they said that Oswald was firing and it was from behind. But also, the Secret Service and the FBI had visited them, talked to them about their findings and so forth, and they'd shown them the autopsy report. And the autopsy report said that it was a wound of exit. And so they concluded, based upon the autopsy protocol, that they had been mistaken in their original perception of a wound of entrance.
What is indeed ironic is the fact that the Dallas doctors changed their opinions of the wound based upon the autopsy report. Yet the doctors who performed the autopsy never even saw the bullet wound in the front of the president's throat.
They missed the wound in the front of the president's neck. They assumed that it was only a tracheostomy, a surgical incision made into the trachea, the windpipe, in order to facilitate breathing in a person who has sustained massive brain damage, such as happened in Kennedy's case. And they never learned until the next day that this was a tracheostomy superimposed upon a bullet hole. They did not trace out the bullet wounds in Kennedy's back or neck. They did not talk with the doctors, and they did not recognize then that this was a hole. This is incredible when you think about it, because the president died from gunshot wounds, and yet here we have people doing the autopsy who missed one of those wounds.
In fact, the doctors who performed the autopsy were so confused as to the true nature of the president's wounds that their official report identifies the back wound as only presumably of entry, and the throat wound as only presumably of exit. Yet it was upon this point that the commission's entire case rested.
The difference between it being of entrance and of exit is as great a difference as there can be. So it's not acceptable to say that it's presumably a wound of entrance, but that's what they did.
Had this case ever gone to court, these pathologists would have been destroyed on cross-examination by a competent defense attorney.
This prompted critics to question not only the autopsy findings, but the competence of the pathologist as well.
The autopsy doctors were not the ones who should have been selected for this, because it was outside their experience. There's a big difference between studying forensic medicine in a short course, as a couple of them had, and having the day-to-day practice of dealing with murders. None of them had the experience of dealing with murders.
Some of America's finest forensic pathologists, medical people who perform autopsies and who have worked for the federal government in the past on critical cases in the Washington, D.C. area, stood by their telephones that evening when the president's body was returned to Washington, D.C., but they were never called. Instead, the individuals in charge of the autopsy selected two administrators, individuals who had rarely performed autopsies, to come in and perform one of the most important autopsies in this century.
I don't hesitate in criticizing, not because criticism of the autopsy puts the lie to the Warren Commission reports. I've seen many ridiculously incompetent, inadequate, woefully incomplete medical legal autopsies over 25 years of consultation in death cases throughout the country. And I must say that in many of the instances it doesn't wind up making much difference because the basics may be there. In this case, however, the lack of competence, the lack of thoroughness, the lack of precision of the autopsy all enable us to demonstrate that the Warren Commission's conclusions are inaccurate. I would say, without exaggerating, that this was one of the worst medical legal autopsies that I've ever seen.
The president got an autopsy that wouldn't have been acceptable for a Bowery bum. But Oswald got an autopsy fitting of a president. There aren't real questions about Oswald's autopsy, and there were nothing but questions about the president's autopsy.
One of the most important and controversial questions concerned the location of the wound in the president's back. This sketch, prepared at the direction of the pathologist, places the wound at the base of the president's neck, a location which was essential to the single bullet theory. For only if the back wound was above the throat wound could the bullet have the necessary downward trajectory to then hit Governor Connally below the right armpit. Substantial evidence, however, completely contradicted this location of the wound, placing it not in the president's neck, but much lower down on his back.
In any investigation of this kind, in any investigation of a homicide, one of the most important pieces of evidence is the death certificate. What the certificate of death signed by the president's own physician says, with no ifs and buts, is that the president was shot at the level of the third thoracic vertebra.
This low position of the wound at the level of the third thoracic vertebra was confirmed by the autopsy body chart. Prepared by the doctors during their examination of the body, this diagram clearly shows that the bullet entered not in the president's neck, but almost 6 inches lower in his back. This location also coincides with the holes which the bullet made in the president's clothes. Photographs of Kennedy's jacket and shirt confirm the fact that the bullet entered nearly 6 inches lower than the commission claimed.
The autopsy doctors lied when they said that the wound was not in the president's back, but was in his neck where it joins the shoulder. There is no way that they could have made that mistake by accident. You can't possibly make a mistake. The death certificate itself says that it was at the third thoracic vertebra. The body chart they made during the autopsy shows that it's 4 inches lower than they testified to. The holes in the president's clothing shows that is where the body chart says it is. It is where the death certificate says it is. There is no evidence that the bullet was not in the president's back, and there is no way they could have made that mistake innocently.
But the doctors had to mislocate the wound in order to make the commission's lone assassin theory possible.
They moved the bullet hole up several inches to make it fit in with the scenario of Oswald having done the shooting from the 6th floor window. The sketch made on the night of the autopsy showed the bullet hole almost 6 inches down below the level of the top of the shoulder, and yet the bullet emerged from the level of the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple. They didn't know that, however, you see, when they made the diagram, because they never knew that there was a bullet hole in the front of the president's neck. They thought it was just a surgical incision, a tracheostomy. It was that, but the tracheostomy had been made on top of the bullet hole. And now when they learned that the hole in the front of the neck was also a bullet hole, and it was at the level of the knot of the tie, then they couldn't have a hole 6 inches down below the crest of the shoulder and have Oswald doing the shooting from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. So they simply moved it up to the crest of the shoulder.
There was no possibility of anything like this happening if anybody was tried, Lee Harvey Oswald or anybody else. But since they immediately decided without any investigation that Oswald was a lone assassin, once Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, there was nothing to go to trial, and that's when the autopsy revisions began, when the prosector found out that Ruby had killed Oswald.
The death of Lee Harvey Oswald played a key role in the writing of the autopsy report, as Weisberg later found out.
There was nothing about the autopsy that wasn't unusual, including where Dr. Humes wrote it. Understandably, he worked late at night, early in the morning at the Navy Hospital. Instead of going back to his office and working there the next day, he just got everything that he could and went to his, what more appropriate place can you have? His recreation room. And in his recreation room, he wrote out an autopsy report. He just finished writing out, this is his testimony, by the way. He just finished writing his report out when he hears on television that Oswald's been killed. Well, you might ask, what difference does that make to his report? There's only one sense in which he can make a difference. And that is, he knows very well there's not going to be any trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. He's dead. So Dr. Humes said he rewrote the autopsy and burned the original draft.
Dr. Humes' destruction of his original draft, later certified and approved by the president's personal physician, went unchallenged by the Warren Commission. Although we will never know for certain what the original report contained, the evidence appears clear on this point. that once Oswald was dead and there was no possibility of a trial, the autopsy doctors deliberately mislocated the wound in the president's back, a falsification which was essential to the commission's contention that Oswald was the sole assassin.